Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Tai-Chi Kuo, and I currently serve as Treasurer on the National Committee for the American Solidarity Party. Today, I will be moderating the first of 3 planned presidential primary debates between our candidates. Our debate format this afternoon will be as follows. So all candidates will be given the opportunity to provide prepared opening statements and closing minutes, 2 minutes in length each. Our debate topics this afternoon will be healthcare, racial justice, education, and foreign policy. Questions may be asked either to all candidates or any one targeted candidate at a given time. For questions asked to all candidates, each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond, and candidates may use part of their time to rebut or address what was said by an earlier candidate who had already answered the question. For questions targeted at a particular candidate, the targeted candidate will have 2 minutes to respond. An opposing candidate can have 1 minute to rebut or add additional commentary. If they type in the chat field that they would like to respond, I will direct them to come forth and give their rebuttal. Each candidate is allowed a total of 4 rebuttals. At this time, we will be transitioning to our opening statements by our candidates, and so let's meet them now. Our first candidate, Joe Schriner, comes to us from Bluffton in the great state of Ohio. He is a degree journalist from Bowling Green State University and also a former addictions counselor and licensed social worker who specializes in dysfunctional family systems. Mr. Schriner, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute opening statement may begin now.
I was given a campaign talk to a graduate level history class at Toledo University. I told the class that we'd extensively traveled across the country, researching a series of models that, if plugged into every county in the country, would dramatically change the face of America. And while I'm not in a White House yet, I continued, each time I plant a seed about one of these models in the media, during a talk or wherever, and someone picks up on it and tries it in their community, it's as if I get a policy enacted long before I ever get to DC. So I said to the students, you know, it's almost as if I'm president of the United States now. In response, they all smiled politely. However, when we were walking to the campaign vehicle afterwards, my wife, who wasn't smiling as politely, looked up at me and said, you know, it's a happy little world you're living in, honey, isn't it? She always keeps me kind of balanced. So it's not really a happy little world we're living in, is it? America alone, we're at the 60 million abortion mark. Global warming looms like a scary doomsday scenario. We're one push of a button away from nuclear annihilation. Mass shootings are becoming commonplace. Best country on earth? Maybe not in God's eyes, huh? The answer? The ASP, ASAP. That is, the country needs the ASP platform constructs come to life with all these models that I've researched. That's simple. So it's showtime for the ASP, and it's Joe time.
Thank you, Mr. Schriner. So our next candidate, Brian Carroll, comes to us from Visalia in the great state of California. He has been a career educator for 43 years and holds a Master's of Fine Arts from Cal State Fresno and also a history degree from UCLA. Mr. Carroll, you now have the mic, and your 2 minutes opening statement begins now.
I am Brian Carroll, coming to you from England tonight, where I'm here with family. And I did grow up in Los Angeles, moved to Central California after I got married. My education is public schools, UCLA for my bachelor's degree, with a concentration in history of Japan and China, minor in kinesiology. I got my teaching credential, K through 9 at Cal State LA. Later, I added a credential to teach in a bilingual classroom, Spanish-English. In my 50s, I went back to Cal State Fresno, picked up a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. After UCLA, I traveled in Europe for 3 months by myself, lots of time to think and pray. And during that time, I placed my faith in Jesus as my Lord and Savior. My wife and I have been married for 46 years. We have 5 children and 14 grandchildren. In my 44 years of teaching, mostly junior high, some elementary, some high school, mostly public schools. I did teach 2 years in a Christian school and 9 years teaching missionary kids in Colombia. And I also taught some summer school English in China. I have taught US history, world history, Latin American history, journalism, science, PE, English, Spanish, and Bible. I have extensive travel in Colombia and Brazil, 7 weeks in China, 7 months in Europe, 2 weeks each in Israel, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. And I travel to meet people. I have friendships in Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America. And so that's the background that I bring to this campaign.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. So our third and final candidate for the afternoon, Joshua Perkins, comes to us from Houston in the great state of Texas, where he attended Rice University. He is an insurance professional and a married father of 4. Mr. Perkins, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute opening statement begins now.
Thank you, Tai-Chi. Thank you to the National Committee of the American Solidarity Party for arranging this debate. And thank you to my 2 opponents, the other candidates, Mr. Carroll, Mr. Schriner. It's an honor to be speaking with and hopefully not too much against you. I hope today's debate will be cordial and informative for all of the voters and potential voters who are listening. I hope that if you are a member of the party, I thank you for joining. If you're not yet, I hope that you'll listen. Hopefully you'll learn a lot about the American Solidarity Party, Christian democracy, and what we stand for, and be inspired to vote for our candidate, whoever that might be in 2020. I did, as Tai-Chi mentioned, I did grow up in Houston. I was raised in a Republican family, pretty much in the church, the charismatic church. I moved into libertarianism a bit in college, actually pretty far into libertarianism. I voted for Ron Paul in 2008. But I moved toward the center a bit more, realizing that libertarianism was not for me. There's a lot of flaws with it, and I was fortunate enough to find the American Solidarity Party in 2015. It's been a political home ever since. I think that our party, our platform, our principles is the best out there in the United States. I just hope that we are able to get our message out to more and more people, and eventually overturn the political duopoly that we have, so we can have multiple parties, multiple options for people, give people real choices so that they can be happy about the people they vote for, rather than feeling reluctant or unpleasant about the candidates that they feel they have to pull the lever for. So I really hope that we're able to give a great alternative, a principled alternative for voters in this next upcoming presidential election, as well as elections, local, state, and federal in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. So we'll now transition to the debate segment of our afternoon. We'll start from questions from our first topic, healthcare. A bit of a departure from previous. So gentlemen, I know that some of you may not have immediate access to the chat function. So if you want to rebut a particular candidate, raise your hand into the camera and I will be able to recognize you. I see all 4 candidates in camera views currently, so that is perfectly acceptable as well. So our first question is going to be addressed to all candidates and reads as follows. Should abortion services, even in cases where the pregnancy is a cause of extreme mental or emotional distress, such as rape or incest, ever be considered a therapeutic option within the scope of healthcare? Why or why not? The order of response for this group question will begin with Mr. Joe Schriner, followed by Mr. Joshua Perkins, and then by Mr. Brian Carroll. Mr. Schriner, you have the mic, and your 2-minute response may begin now.
Yeah, okay, Tai Chi. I addressed this actually to a degree during the Ask Me Anything thing. And what I believe strongly, the ASP talks about that life begins at conception and goes to natural death, the consistent life ethic. And so I was down in Ocala, Florida. As we've traveled, we've stood in solidarity with a whole lot of people protesting abortion on the streets. I'm standing next to a guy who had been down there for 19 years, week in and week out protesting. And he said, you know, Joe, I've seen what would seem like a lot of good, perhaps, excuses for abortion, whether it's rape or it's incest or it's poverty. And then as an addendum, he said, but even in the midst of all those, I have never seen any reason that would trump killing a small, innocent human being. And so in my particular case, with my campaign and how I read the ASP platform, when it comes to rape, when it comes to incest, that is off the chart as far as allowing it. Now, we have traveled the country extensively looking at help for people in crisis pregnancy. We went to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and looked at Mom's House, where they provide daycare for women in crisis pregnancy. We went to Ocala, Florida, went to Maria Goretti House, where they put up women in crisis pregnancy. And then the church forms a cocoon around them in order to help. On the east side of Cleveland, we researched Womankind, that provides a whole gamut of physical health and mental health for women in crisis pregnancy for free. So point being, we need to generate a whole lot more of an amalgam of help to women in crisis pregnancy in this country, and the things we've researched, if plugged into every county in the country, could provide that.
Thank you, Mr. Schriner. So the next speaker will be Mr. Joshua Perkins. And Mr. Perkins, you now have the mic, and your 2 minutes opening statement, or your 2-minute response may begin now.
While obviously rape and incest are horrible things, and it's a tragic circumstance for the woman, I'm very, very sympathetic to that. But I don't think that the intentional killing of an innocent human being is ever the answer to any sort of problem. I definitely agree with Joe that we need to have services, assistance, help, compassion for these women, and give them all the support that they need. And I do support all kinds of efforts to do so, crisis pregnancy centers, as well as federal, state, and local grants and programs to provide those. So I think that the answer to the question of whether it's healthcare is no. However, I do, unfortunately, since we do live in a world where there are a lot of people who are on the other side of the issue, and completely outlawing abortion is perhaps untenable, at least in some respects. I would be open to, as a compromise measure, providing allowing for those exceptions in the law, if we could pass an abortion bill to essentially eliminate all other abortions, as well as provide the support women need, so that even those who do have these pregnancies resulting from these acts would be able to make a better choice. They'd have the power and the capability to make that choice for life for their children. So it's definitely a tragic circumstance, and not something that should be considered a good thing. But I think it might be a political part of a political solution to permit it in these extenuating circumstances.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So our next respondent will be Mr. Brian Carroll. Mr. Carroll, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute response begins now.
Yes, we cannot correct one bad situation by creating a second tragedy. And politically, this is going to be the biggest challenge. We want healthcare, but we don't want that healthcare to include abortion. And so how we go about that, it'll be a lot of discussion, a lot of political give and take. What we wind up with at the end, I'm not sure what it will look like, but we have to try and make sure that any kind of abortion is not part of the deal. I think we have lots of testimony from women who were pregnant through rape or incest that tell us that what actually helped them heal was seeing the baby. And whether they kept the baby or they put it up for adoption, the baby was actually part of the healing. And so I don't think we want to start carving out exceptions if there's any way we can avoid it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. So this next question is going to be addressed to Mr. Joshua Perkins. Mr. Perkins, in 2017, over 70,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. The American Solidarity Party platform supports the creation of a strong and inclusive social safety net to provide for the needs of those most vulnerable members of society. How would your administration improve our existing drug and mental health programs to better fight this opioid epidemic? Again, the question is, how would your administration improve our existing drug and mental health programs to better fight this opioid epidemic? Mr. Perkins, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute response may begin now.
Well, I think the first answer is obviously to expand them, to fund them far better than we are now, to make them available to all people in all communities, not merely in city centers or the suburbs. We need to also be sure to intentionally target these programs toward rural areas where in some of these areas the opioid crisis is more prominent even than in the cities. And so we need to make sure we go where the need is, and we don't leave these people who are outside of one or more politically popular areas. We don't leave them out of the solution. And then in addition, I think we need to destigmatize mental health counseling. I think there's still a bit of a reluctance among some people. They see it as something for either just for crazy people or something that only weak people need. That if you're strong enough, you're self-sufficient enough, you don't need to have a counselor or a psychiatrist or a therapist to help you out. But I think we need to have educational programs to make people aware that this isn't something only for the weak. It's something that anyone can benefit from at all different kinds of places in their lives, especially those who are struggling with addictions. And then also, I believe we need to decriminalize a lot of these so when you have an addiction, especially to opioids, there's the problem of how do you obtain the addictive substance. And so some people will go to stealing the product or using illegal drugs. And so I think a decriminalization to allow people to feel more comfortable asking for help, not having to worry that they're going to be arrested for a minor drug offense, but rather they can get the help they need to get free from this addiction so that they don't have the problem anymore.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. Do we have any rebuttals or additional comments from the floor? I recognize those at the time. All right, the floor recognizes Mr. Joe Schriner. Mr. Schriner, you now have the mic, and your 1-minute response may begin now.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, part of what I did career-wise was I was an addictionologist. And when you look at opioids, just an example, we have 150 opioid deaths a day in America. That would be like a half-full airliner going down every day in the United States. If that was happening, we'd close the skies immediately. And so our administration would, on hyperdrive, mobilize a lot more prevention and rehab programs for people that were drug addicted across the board. Again, when you talk about the ASP and the safety net, we need to not only have a safety net, we also need to be as proactive as possible, again, with prevention programs. And we've researched a whole lot of them across the country, like DARE programs, a whole lot of things. Local mental health agencies have prevention programs, and we need to pump a lot more money, a lot more resources into those. And I believe that strongly, because if we don't deal with this thing at the roots, it keeps growing back just like a weed.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. We'll be moving on to our next question at this time. This next question is addressed to Mr. Brian Carroll. Mr. Carroll, at a recent debate, the U.S. Senator from your home state of California, Kamala Harris, was scrutinized over her record on drug enforcement. If elected president, would you support the continued prosecution of marijuana possession and distribution crimes at the federal level with punishments which include incarceration? Why or why not? Mr. Carroll, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute response begins now.
Well, I think we have tried various kinds of prohibition, and even the Prohibition Party has moved away from advocating total legal prohibition of things and moved in the direction of education. We have filled up our prisons with people who get long sentences for possession. Marijuana is dangerous, and we want to do everything we can to explain that to people so that they are not going to get involved in it. I saw that with tobacco when I first started teaching in Farmersville, California in 1977. The amount of tobacco on our campus was horrible. Anytime you walked into a restroom, there were 25 kids in there smoking, and now they don't. There is no tobacco on campus anymore, and I think it's education that did that. They may be smoking at home, but they're not, at least they're not smoking at school the way they were. And I think we need to have that kind of a campaign against marijuana, but we're not gaining anything by putting people in prison. We're breaking up families. We have kids that their dads or their moms are in prison. And that's not what our party is about. Our party is not about breaking up families and putting people away for a long time. People who are trafficking in it, yes, but not the people who are using it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. So are there any rebuttals or additional comments from the floor? All right, if not, then we'll move on to our next question. This next question goes to Mr. Joe Schriner. Mr. Schriner, the top 10 U.S. pharmaceutical drug companies combined hold over $1.4 trillion in terms of market capitalization in 2018. The average American spends approximately $1,200 per person on prescription drugs per year. How would your administration engage with the pharmaceutical industry, and what reforms would you enact? And Mr. Schriner, your 2-minute response begins now.
Very good. Number one, the drug companies have become a leviathan. And I think that we need to look at using the Sherman Antitrust Act with some of them. For instance, the Lilly Foundation out of Indianapolis. And that is, again, one part of the problem. But the reciprocal response in this particular thing is that, and it's very analogous to the drug cartels south of the border. We're always pointing to them, but what we have to look at is who's creating the demand for the drugs? That's us. Read the US. And so that needs, again, to go back to the endemic root cause of this. We have to look at who's driving the demand north of the border. Well, it's the same thing with prescription drugs. Part of who's providing the demand is us. And so I was down in Athens, Georgia, and I interviewed an ER doctor down there for our healthcare platform. One of the things he said to me was, he goes, Joe, 33 to 50% of the people that come into the ER don't need to come into the ER. But we are a society that has gotten so used to not being in any pain, even for a short period of time. So it's been better living by chemicals. And so we would instruct the Surgeon General to start a campaign, a very robust campaign in order to do a lot more prevention around these things. And what, a lot of times they're looking at opioids where maybe a couple ibuprofen would work just as well. I mean, just common sense. So, but a lot of people don't know that. So this education campaign would be multidimensional. And Brian had just mentioned about smoking. Look at all the prevention stuff that happened and how smoking cut down exponentially as a result. Same thing with this.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. Are there any rebuttals or additional comments from the floor? All right, the floor recognizes Mr. Joshua Perkins. Mr. Perkins, your 1 minute response may begin now.
I think that one of the biggest problems is the prices that drug companies are allowed to charge for their products, and the fact that they're allowed to advertise directly to the consumer. We're the only one of 2 countries in the world where that is permitted. And I think that's quite problematic when we don't have medical professionals who are able to diagnose and to advise patients, giving them the best options. Instead, we see a fancy commercial that promises to cure your ailment, and then we go to the doctor and say, well, I like this drug because it looks like it works, I guess, without any of the expertise or research that the medical professionals have. So I think that's one of the problems. And then as well, the prices that they charge are just exorbitant in many cases. And so I think I would be in favor of enacting price controls on the pharmaceutical drug companies for how much they can charge, as well as funding research and development publicly in many cases. And then finally, limiting for-profit drug companies, or making them all become nonprofits so that they're not trying to get more money out of the consumers.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. So with that, that concludes our segment on healthcare, and we will now transition to the second topic in our debate, racial justice. This first question is addressed to all candidates and reads as follows. Do you support government reparations / restitutions for African Americans and Native Americans for historic injustices? And if so, what shape or form should such reparations or restitution take? The order of response for this group question will begin with Mr. Joshua Perkins, followed by Mr. Brian Carroll, and then concluding with Mr. Joe Schriner. So Mr. Perkins, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute response begins now.
This is, of course, a difficult issue because the injustices were in many cases long ago, although in some cases more recent, and they are very complicated, complex, intertwined with other issues. So to answer the question simply, I do believe there should be some sort of restitution for the injustices that have been perpetrated against African Americans and Native Americans. The form that takes is obviously something that is more controversial, even I think, than the fact of having such actions. And I think that one of the things we need to remember when we talk about this is that it's not just so long ago, and it's not just private bias that led to these injustices. I was reading something by Richard Rothstein the other day. He's a researcher who talks about how the U.S. government, the federal government, from 1930s through the 1970s, enacted segregation in cities intentionally and directly, and as well as indirectly and encouraging segregation in other ways. And so the fact that we've had direct government intervention in the past several decades to perpetuate these wrongs means that we need to have direct government intervention to right them as well. Again, as to how this works, I think that the first thing we need to do, the most important thing, is to have an honest discussion, an honest national discussion about it. We need to reckon with and recognize all the ways in which we have wronged these communities and the ways in which we continue to do so. And then from that, I think we might be able to, once we've done that, once we have been able to all recognize that systemic racism and systemic injustices still exist, then I think we might be able to come to some sort of solution as a nation to recompense these people for these wrongs.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So the floor now recognizes Brian Carroll. Mr. Carroll, your 2-minute response begins now.
Yeah, this one hit me between the eyes personally a couple of weeks ago. I went up to visit the mountain cabin where my mother's family had a, a cabin up there for over close to a century. And the Forest Service had cleared that off and put up a camp demonstrating how it was used there by the Native Americans. And I realized that I had been enjoying something that was taken from them. And then the next day I was reading in Numbers, and it said, when you realize that you have done something to hurt somebody and deprive them of something, you're supposed to return it with an additional fifth. And I don't think that we can do the math and figure out what exactly it is. But the idea is, yeah, you want to make things right. Sometimes it's just the process of giving back something so that you are accepting the fact that you have a responsibility there. And the very act of giving something helps to make it right. There is no way to go back and calculate exactly what was taken from who and by whom and who benefited. But we know that as a country, we have benefited from the things, both the land and the labor that we took away from people. And we need to make that right. And it may be in educational programs that we can do to help a community, or in putting hospitals where there have not been hospitals in some of those communities, improving their way of life, their community behavior. We just need to give them something.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. So we will conclude this question with Mr. Joe Schreiner's response. Mr. Schreiner, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute response may begin now.
Very good. Yeah, picking up on what Brian said, I think that there needs to be some kind of remuneration. And with the ASP under civil rights, it talks about protecting marginalized groups. And two of the most marginalized groups, Blacks and Native Americans. But I believe it's more than protecting their rights. It's significantly enhancing their lives. Example, I've been all over the country looking at Native American issues. Our position paper on this topic, in fact, was used as a college text, as a chapter in a college textbook on social justice. We broke treaty after treaty after treaty with the Native Americans, stole a majority of their land, quarantined them on reservations, and many are still in bad straits today. We've been to multiple reservations and saw this firsthand. Our plan on the front end is to give some of the land back to the Native Americans through subdividing national lands and through creative land trusts and such. And we propose a multi-dimensional set of programs to reverse poverty and establish more sustainability in the Native American communities. But what's more, and probably most important, is that our administration would spark a Native American renaissance across the country, not only to help rejuvenate their culture, but to learn from their culture, as God probably had intended from the beginning. I think they were supposed to learn from us, we were supposed to learn from them, and through synergy, create this phenomenal culture. As an addendum, and again, some Brian said, I'm Catholic. I go to confession, I say, Father, I stole 20 bucks from Harry. He's gonna say to me, Joe, I sense a contrition in your voice, but your penance is to give Harry the 20 bucks back with interest. That's the same deal with this. We made a mistake at the beginning and we need to make it right.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schreiner. So now we'll be moving on to the next question. And our next question will be going to Mr. Brian Carroll. Mr. Carroll, studies show that in the United States, African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white Americans. What steps would you take to support American law enforcement officers, yet also ensure that they conduct their mission to serve and protect underprivileged communities and communities of color fairly? Mr. Carroll, you have 2 minutes, and that response time may begin.
Well, when I graduated from high school, my generation thought that we would solve this problem and it wouldn't be a problem 50 years later. And obviously it still is. And I think we are making good steps in the right direction with cameras on police officers. And one of the things it's showing us is that there's still a problem. We've got to do better training of our officers. Excuse me. We have to do more relations building between the officers and the community. We need to do, there's ideas out there. We just need to take every single idea and play with it until we can solve this. There's just no excuse for a statistic like this. And there's a lot of people, of course, that don't even believe that it's true. And so partly it's education to explain to white America that it is a problem and that it needs to be addressed with vigor.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. Are there any rebuttals or additional comments? The floor recognizes Mr. Joshua Perkins. Mr. Perkins, your 1 minute response or additional comments begins.
Thank you. So there's certainly a problem. I appreciate this question. I appreciate Brian's response as well. I think that there are lots of different ways, as he mentioned, that's different steps that we need to take to reduce this. I think one of them is training on unconscious bias for police officers and implementing ways to help reduce the effect of that in policing. As well, we also need to look at how we prioritize patrols and other encounters with the public. And then we also need to, I believe, overhaul the justice system and how it works, where police officers are given the benefit of the doubt in almost every circumstance, whereas private citizens are not. And the disparity there leads to gross injustices many times.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So this next question goes to Mr. Joseph Schriner. Mr. Schriner, the U.S. Census Bureau's 2013 to 17 findings show that America's great northern cities, such as Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland in your home state of Ohio, remain the most segregated by race. Meanwhile, tract level census data also shows that minority neighborhoods within these cities remain poorer than other neighborhoods. If elected, what would your administration do to fight poverty in the inner city and better the livelihoods of longtime residents? So, Mr. Schriner, you have 2 minutes and your response time begins now.
As president, I would not move into the White House. I would move into urban DC. And I've said that a lot to the press over the years. Us as a family moved into a gang war zone in Cleveland for 5 years to do outreach with Catholic workers there. We think part of the answer, what's happened that led to this situation, is there's been a tremendous amount of white flight out of the city. And so we propose a series of things. Number one, and we need to, after Katrina down in New Orleans, when the urban planners came in, what they did was they set up these neighborhoods where there was upper middle class houses next to middle class houses next to lower class houses. What that did was that brought a whole lot more people into the city too, and here's the ASP word, live in solidarity with the poor. One of the reasons for the cauldron of the violence and the poverty is because those people are trapped down there. And so as president, living in urban DC, hopefully much more than Michelle Obama's garden, this will inspire a whole lot of people to move down into the city again, to live in solidarity and to help. We also believe strongly in community-oriented policing. We think that's an excellent thing. And what that does, and I've researched that all over the country, is it connects the citizens with the police so that the police are no longer enemies, but they're liaisons. And so the more you can break down some of the systemic suspicion on the part of the citizens towards the police, the better. And these things have been proven to work. But it's about people taking a deep breath, especially people maybe in the party who have some form of faith, who are willing to put their lives on the lines like these officers are willing to put their lives on their line, to move back in to make a difference in those communities. That's the real answer. We keep sitting out in the suburbs throwing rhetoric and constructs at a situation that needs our hands-on help. And so again, as president, you would find me down there way more than you would find me in some comfy little room in the White House.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. Do we have any rebuttals or additional responses from the floor? All right, if not, we can move on. So now, this next question goes to Mr. Joshua Perkins. Mr. Perkins, according to the NAACP, if African Americans and Latino Americans were incarcerated at the same rate as white Americans, prison and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. What steps would your administration take to ensure fairness in the prosecution or sentencing process for minorities and reduce mass incarceration? Mr. Perkins, you have 2 minutes and your response time may begin now.
Well, I think it starts with what we were talking about earlier with regard to law enforcement, because the way that the police departments are set up to patrol these higher crime neighborhoods, which are also higher minority population often, they patrol those more often, and they take in people more often from there. Those people obviously get convicted more often. As you mentioned, you know, the incarceration rates are drastically disparate among races. But what studies have found repeatedly is that rates of things like drug use and other crimes are not different by race. They're actually fairly similar, quite similar. For example, Black people and white people use drugs at just about the same rate, but a Black person is about 3 or 4 times more likely to be in prison for a drug conviction than a white person is. So I think it starts with enforcement. It starts with making sure we have fairness there. It also starts with changing the laws so that nonviolent drug possession, for example, is decriminalized, so that we don't have these people being picked up for having a very small amount of a recreational drug and then sent to prison for several years. I think we also need to change the justice system to remove cash bail. For example, Harris County, where I live, had a recent settlement where we had to end or greatly modify cash bail because it ends up making prison a debtor's prison where poor people aren't able to get out. And so they have to stay there till their trial date for several months, whereas people who are better off are able to go out and live their lives. And of course, people who have to stay in prison, they are willing to take a plea deal so they can get out earlier, get back to their friends, their family, their life. Whereas those who are able to be out in the community, they can also afford to fight it better. So we need to have more equity in the judicial system for defendants' criminal cases. And then I would also want to enact amnesty or a commutation of sentences for nonviolent drug offenses for those who are in federal custody presently.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. Do we have any rebuttals as the floor recognizes Mr. Joe Schriner? Mr. Schriner, you have 1 minute to respond. Your response time begins now. Oh, sorry. Now, there we go.
Mix me up, Tai Chi. As an addendum to what Joshua was saying, my daughter is just back from Steubenville, Ohio, where she's a social worker and she did an internship at a prison in Pittsburgh. And she said to me last night, she goes, "Dad, you know what? There are so many people there as a direct result of drugs or alcohol." And I interviewed a guy named Mark West in Fostoria, Ohio, who started this great program called Oasis in prisons all across the country. And what he said to me was 80% of people in prison are there because of drugs or alcohol, or they committed the crime to get money to get drugs or alcohol. And so we need to look at this again, to use my phraseology, systemically, and work on prevention programs and quality rehab, much more than there is now within the context of mental health in this country. And our administration would robustly move in that direction in order to, again, get this dealt with at its roots as opposed to just on the surface.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. So now we will be transitioning to the next topic in our debate segment. This one is on education. So our first question is directed to all candidates and reads as follows. All candidates, do you support the Common Core State Standards Initiative regarding educational programming? If so, why? If not, why? And what would you put in its place? The order of response for this group question will begin with Mr. Brian Carroll, followed by Mr. Joshua Perkins and Mr. Joe Schriner. Mr. Carroll, you do have the floor, and your 2-minute response time will begin now.
I have serious problems with the Common Core state standards. I think we have gone to the point where we are dictating what we teach and then over testing rather than trusting our teachers to have the ability to look at a class and decide what is needed. We are trying to do a one-size-fits-all, which winds up being a one-size-fits very few. As a teacher, obviously I went ahead and did what I was told, which was putting the Common Core standards in, but I was never comfortable with that. I didn't think that it was necessarily the things that my own students needed most. And so what I would put in its place is more trust in the teachers to assess the class and decide what people needed. There is a problem. If you go too far that direction, then you wind up with teachers looking at a class that's several years behind in their level of reading or their level of math. And so you're taking an 8th grade math class and teaching them 3rd grade math, trying to bring them up. You don't want to go too far that direction. But you cannot assume that everybody in the United States needs to be on the same page of the book the same day. And Common Core tends to teach to the test, way too much testing. They don't need that much testing. And so I would not follow that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. So the next respondent for this question would be Mr. Joshua Perkins. Mr. Perkins, your 2-minute response time begins now.
I share some of Brian Carroll's concerns about testing, especially. I think that the over-testing and teaching to the test has become endemic, especially here in Houston. I hear stories almost every month during the school year about how students or how teachers are very frustrated because almost all of their time is spent making sure that their students can pass the state test rather than teaching them what they think they should be learning based on their experience of the classroom and their own pedagogical learning education. So I think that sort of application of a common set of standards is very problematic. I think additionally, the fact that we have so much emphasis on testing means that kids are in their chairs a lot more, just listening to lectures and whatnot. Whereas I think that there needs to be a bit of a refocus on getting kids outside more, a lot more recess time, a lot more play time, interactive learning, different options of that sort. I do think that the idea of a strictly advisory, broad set of standards being published by some national organization as a sort of a guideline for what to expect at the end of elementary school, at the end of junior high, at the end of high school is a good idea. But I don't think that the Common Core, the way that it has been set up, is the answer for that or the solution for that need.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So our final respondent for this question will be Mr. Joe Schriner. Mr. Schriner, your 2-minute response time begins now.
Okay, we have traveled all over the country interviewing educators around for our education position paper. And I can tell you, I not once in maybe 40 interviews with teachers heard one of them say, yeah, I think Common Core is a real good idea. Kind of what Brian was saying. What happens is the kids become robotic, the teachers become robotic to a degree, and there's not a lot of creativity. If I could, and I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but I just wrote a column this week in our local newspaper about a marine biology teacher right here in the middle of cornfields. His name is Mr. Hoff. Mr. Hoff has this class, it's called Ocean Focus. They meet for an hour before regular school and it's always full. And at the end of the year, he takes them down to the Florida Keys and they go snorkeling, they go to research centers, they go all over the place. And people just love that here. Now, there's no Common Core category for this particular class. So he has the leeway to be as creative as possible. I said in the column that he would be akin to Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society. You know, this guy is so on fire and so passionate for this particular thing. But I'm sure he gets hamstrung in his regular biology classes around the stuff Brian and Joshua both were talking about. Like I would want, without raising one of my opponents to on a big pedestal, but based on what I've read on the streams from Brian, he's talking about a history teacher who knows history and can bring it to life a whole lot of different ways. And my guess is, as Brian said, he feels hamstrung by that. So my administration would move very far away from the Bush era Common Core stuff and look a lot more at, again, subsidiarity, putting a lot more power back into the hands of the teachers to be able to creatively teach to the students, because different students have different needs, and who knows better than the teacher.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. So we'll be moving on to our next question. This first question also goes to Mr. Schriner. So, Mr. Schriner, the most recent figures show that American students pay on average over $10,000 a year for in-state tuition, or potentially upwards of $50,000 a year for private or out-of-state tuition. This high price tag on education has proved to be a significant barrier on access for many. If you were elected president, what would your administration do to ensure that young Americans can afford to pursue higher education? Mr. Schriner, you have 2 minutes, and your response time may begin now.
Okay, very good. I gave a couple talks to a political science class at Baldwin Wallace University in Ohio. What they have done is created a fast track 3-year program for students to get a degree. Canada has done the same thing. That cuts off 1 year right there. Also, another thing that we propose, I've done a whole lot of research at community colleges. And one of the things that we propose is a fast track major itself that was only 2 years, where you didn't have to take what many would deem just extraneous subjects as electives, but instead you picked the courses that were germane to your major and just took those. And were able to finish in 2 years. And if there was enough schools going to that paradigm, then that particular degree would be more honored by businesses out in the general society. Another thing that we think really makes a whole lot of sense is Yellow Springs, Ohio. We went down there to Antioch College, and what they have is a work-study program. You go to school for a semester, then you go out and work for a semester in your field as an intern. Then you come back, you go to school for another semester, and you work. That goes on for 4 years. Because how many kids, talk about this, affordability, how many kids get done at the end of 4 years and they've shelled out $100,000, $150,000, they're 6 months into the work thing, and they say to themselves, gee, I don't think I particularly like this profession. What a tremendous amount of wasted money and time, a lot of times. So our administration, as with the other education we're talking about around Common Core, we would approach higher education with a lot more creative take on what we need to do to shift that around and make it more common sense.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. Do we have any rebuttals or additional comments from the floor? If not, we can move on to, Mr. Perkins. The floor recognizes Mr. Perkins. Mr. Perkins, you have a 1-minute response, which can begin now.
So there's been a lot of talk about paying for college education for all, college tuition for all American citizens. I think that there's definitely some benefits to that, but I do think that we need to make sure that vocational training is not forgotten in that debate, discussion. Something that even if we don't get to universal paid college tuition, even if we don't get to that, I think something that we should certainly do would be to implement an income-based repayment for all student loans, and also to allow them to be discharged in bankruptcy, as they currently are not. I was reading a story about someone from the UK where they have income-based repayment, I think, for all student loans, as I understand it. And so this person for, I think 10, maybe 15 years pays a fixed percentage of whatever her income was. And then at the end of that, her loan is discharged, even if the entire amount has not yet been repaid. And that way we don't have people with crushing debt and dead-end jobs that they just have to work at in order to make the monthly payments.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. So we're going to be moving on to our next question, which is also addressed to Mr. Joshua Perkins. Mr. Perkins, the U.S. Census Bureau studies have shown that K through 12 education in 12 states, including your home state of Texas, have still not recovered to pre-2008 recession levels. If elected president, what would your administration do at the federal level to ensure that education funding is sufficient throughout the United States, especially for low-income families? Mr. Perkins, you have 2 minutes. Your response time begins now.
That's a bit of a difficult one. We have in Texas, we've had for the past several years an ongoing debate about how to finance schools and having school financing reform. There have been multiple court decisions saying that the current system is unacceptable or unconstitutional. The legislature has been trying to get something done. They haven't been able to for the last few sessions. So we're definitely having this problem here where there's disparate funding based on where you live. So low-income places often have lower income or lower funding for their schools and lower quality of education. And this, I think, illustrates the problem, which is that this is all being done at the state level. The federal government isn't stepping in to do much here. And I'm not sure that there is all that much to be done directly. I think that certainly encouraging state governments and local governments, county governments, cities to fund their schools well, perhaps initiating some sort of programs with incentives or grants would be a good idea. But I think that this is something that would, in keeping with our adherence to the principle of subsidiarity, would really need to be directly addressed at a lower level. So the president can use his bully pulpit to give the recommendations that he thinks to advise people, to urge people to do the right thing. But this sort of thing, I think, has to be handled at a lower level.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Do we have any rebuttals or additional comments from the floor? Mr. Carroll, you have 1 minute to respond. Give me 1 second. And your response time may begin now.
Yes, I think it's quite appropriate for the federal government to augment financially local school districts in poor areas. It needs to come with the fewest strings possible. But for 5 or 6 years, my salary at my last school district was from the federal government, and it was entirely to lower class size. And the only string that was attached to it was that our average class size in our academic subjects could not climb above 24. And I think that was totally appropriate. The other thing is the federal lunch program, which is being cut back now. But that's an area where in a poor school district, a lot of time the kids don't get adequate nutrition, and they cannot study properly if they're not getting a good lunch and a good breakfast. And so I think we need to reverse the course on that and bring up the amount of money that the federal government is putting into the lunch program.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. So with now we'll move on to an additional question from Mr. Carroll. So this question is that in 2015, an average of $10,740 per student was spent on private school education. If elected president, what would you do to ensure that alternative education options remain viable for American parents who desire to educate their children based on deeply held community or family values distinct from what is being offered in the public school system. Mr. Carroll, you have 2 minutes, and your response time may begin now.
Well, I have taught in public school and private school. We didn't homeschool, but we have a lot of friends who did. And I think that each of those systems has value, but has slightly different benefits, and it brings different things to the table to make them advantageous. And I know there are people who would like to see the federal government give vouchers for private education. I'm real hesitant to do that because I'm suspicious that the private schools would give away one of their distinctives. When I was teaching in the private Christian school, we had an incredible amount of parent involvement. But you can imagine if a parent or a family is giving that much energy and finances into educating their kids, they are also going to be very, very attentive to what's going on. And that's a real benefit to any classroom. And I hesitate to water that down. I think the private schools, their greatest benefit is the amount of parent involvement they have. I think we can give tax write-offs for tuition and things like that. But I'm real hesitant to go with the vouchers. I think we need to have healthy public schools. We need to have healthy private schools. We need to support the parents that are homeschooling with things like extra music programs at the public school and things like that they can take advantage of. But I think we have to figure out ways to make all of them healthy.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. Oh, so Mr. Schriner, the floor recognizes Mr. Schriner. You have 1 minute to respond, and your response time may begin now.
Yeah, and again, to dovetail with what Brian's saying is I don't believe in vouchers. I was in the state of Washington. I met with the high school principal there, and he goes, Joe, this is what happens with that deal. He goes, in the cities, the cream of the crop are taken from those particular schools where kids are struggling and put in better charter schools and the like, leaving those others abandoned. I think that the answer is for the Department of Education, through some really creative stimulus initiations, or incentives, to make every school a charter quality school. We have abdicated our responsibility and left those kids abandoned down in those cities. We need to raise taxes. We need to help. We need to, as I said earlier, have people move back down in the cities to live in solidarity to increase the tax base in order to make those schools the way they should across the board. Because the ASP stands for what? The common good for everyone.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. So with that, we will transition to our fourth and final topic of our debate segment, foreign policy. So our first question is addressed to all candidates and reads as follows. In 2019, the United States has 1, shot down an Iranian drone in the Strait of Hormuz, and 2, sailed 2 destroyers through the Taiwan Strait. If elected president, what would be your approach towards America's post-World War II role of global policeman, and how would that approach further a more peaceful world? So the order of response for this question will be firstly to Mr. Joe Schriner, followed by Mr. Brian Carroll, and then concluding with Mr. Joshua Perkins. So Mr. Schriner, you have the mic, and your 2-minute response may begin.
All right. Number one is that in the context of this global policeman deal, part of how we're globally policing, so to speak, is with a very big stick, i.e. nuclear weapons. The American Solidarity Party calls for an end to the use of nuclear weapons. And see, we're using those nuclear weapons now. We're using them in 2 ways. 1, to coerce other countries, and 2, we're using them to protect ourselves. And so our platform would be about unilateral nuclear disarmament. In tandem, right now, a good example with foreign affairs, our national budget allocates 4% for foreign aid. But you know how much we allocate for the military? 57%. And so our administration would cut back exponentially on the military, in line, I think, with the ASP's just war principles. And we would take those savings, and instead of a American military superpower, what we believe is we should be an American humanitarian superpower. So we would take the planes and the boats and some of them, et cetera, and turn them into humanitarian conveyances to get more food and help as we would ramp up. We propose a U.S. Department of Peace, and one component of that is to ramp up Peace Corps work exponentially. Sending thousands and thousands of people out into other countries in order to create sustainability, including into Iran. Just as an addendum, we went down to Cummers, Georgia, and met with the guy that went with Jimmy Carter to Iran and very quietly started to do Habitat for Humanitarian builds in North Korea because of how poverty-stricken that is. Under our administration, with the Bush era faith-based initiatives, we would mobilize a whole lot more of that kind of help. So that's our foreign policy would spin around helping more, which is what the ASP policy is all about.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. So our next respondent will be Mr. Brian Carroll. Mr. Carroll, you have 2 minutes. You have the mic, and your response time may begin now.
Since 1980, we have not been without a war going on someplace. And those wars have all had something to do with oil. So the first thing we need to do is get off oil. We have to break our habit with either nuclear or solar or wind or some combination of that, so that we're not sending our boys off to war to defend our oil supply. Secondly, we are going into a period where global warming is going to create mass migrations and all kinds of epidemics and things, which is also going to aggravate war. So there's another reason why we have to get off oil for our foreign policy. And there are things that we cannot tolerate. We cannot tolerate foreign countries interfering with our elections. And we need to technologically do things that can stop them from breaking into our election equipment and getting into our social media with false news designed to create tensions and problems in our country that are there, but not to the degree that the countries are aggravating them. As far as like with China and the Taiwan Strait, we are not going to solve all the world's problems. We are not going to solve the problem in Hong Kong. And we need to admit that we are not going to be the world's policeman in situations like that, and look for other ways to try and convince people to get along.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. Mr. Perkins, you now have the mic, and your 2-minute response begins.
I think that we need to focus on peace more than on military strength and maintaining a first strike capability, for example. I think that diplomacy should always be the first step, that any type of military action needs to be an absolute last resort. I think that engaging in provocative actions, as the examples given of shooting down the drone and sailing destroyers near potential enemies is unwise, it's reckless, and it should not be happening at all. I definitely do think we need to have, obviously, a military for the defense of our nation and of our citizens. However, I think, as Joe mentioned, the funding for it is just outlandish. It's just far too high. We could cut it by half, by 75%, or more, and still have more than enough capability to take on any potential aggressors. So I think that would be one of the things we need to do, is to drastically reduce military expenditures. And then also I think we need to make sure that our interventions are limited to only as a last resort of self-defense, or only for urgent humanitarian interventions. And in both cases, they should be limited as possible, so that we do not have unintended or collateral damage, as they say, killing of civilians, whether intentionally or unintentionally, or displacing people from their homes. We are for peace, definitely before war, and before strength even, I think.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll move on to our next question at this time. So this first question goes to Mr. Joshua Perkins. Mr. Perkins, the Trump administration has been particularly aggressive in seeking a nuclear deal with North Korea. He's met with Chairman Kim Jong-un on several occasions, most recently at the Korean Demilitarized Zone in June. If elected president, what would be your policy when engaging with North Korea and other nations with which the United States has shared an adversarial relationship in recent history? Mr. Perkins, you have 2 minutes to respond, and your time begins now.
Well, I think for North Korea particularly, I think that legitimizing Kim Jong-un by meeting with him was a very poor choice. This is perhaps the worst country in the world in terms of its human rights record at this present time, and yet the Chairman Kim is being lauded by the president and praised by him for numerous things that are fairly insignificant, while the plight of the people of North Korea is being ignored. So I think that our position when engaging with these adversarial these adversaries should be to seek peace, to be diplomatic, but we also need to stop ignoring human rights abuses, as we have been doing, not just in the past 3 years, but in the past 20, 30 years. The policy of economics first, of trade first, being more important. Let's make our citizens' lives more comfortable. And if these other citizens of other countries aren't so well off, well, that's too bad. But as long as we get our cheap TVs and our electronic devices, we'll let it slide. That sort of thinking is it's antithetical to solidarity on a global scale. And so I think that, again, as I said, diplomacy. We need to be diplomatic. We need to seek peace, but we also need to confront these egregious human rights violations when they occur.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. All right, the floor recognizes Joe Schriner in regards to a response. Mr. Schriner, this is a reminder, this is your 3rd response, so you have 1 more remaining after this. So you have 1 minute to respond, and your time will begin now.
Yeah, I need to just say that I'm on the exact same page as Joshua when it comes to this. Whether it's China or it's North Korea, the human rights violations are off the chart. You look at China with the forced abortions, not that we're much better, but taking dissidents, quote unquote, and jailing them, torturing them, killing them. Hong Kong in that situation right now, and them on the precipice of losing democracy. However, one of the things with North Korea, as an example, if you're going to try and build peace, is that in the research that I did, the UN back in 1950 gave the United States executive control over cordoning that country off. And so what they did was they artificially created this demilitarized zone with the line. Well, that line goes through the Yellow Sea, and it affords South Korea way better fishing than North Korea, which is a big industry over there. And that's created tension in the Yellow Seas. And you see North Korea bombing a couple of those little islands in the Yellow Sea. That's not just happenstance. So our administration would sit down with North Korea and South Korea and try and come up with a more agreeable line. Now, that's not the answer to the whole thing, but if you're going to do diplomacy, you have to find specifics as a starting point and start to compromise. And so in this particular case, I think that that's extremely important. And to go back to the reason they're building their nuclear weapons is because they're afraid of our nuclear weapons.
All right,
So
thank
at
you,
some
Mr.
point,
Schriner.
we have to look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Schriner. So we'll be moving on to our next question at this time. This next question is addressed to Mr. Joe Schriner. So Mr. Schriner, to date, approximately 10,000 Palestinians and over 1,000 Israelis have been killed by someone on the other side since the year 2000. Excluding East Jerusalem, the number of Israeli settlers living in the West Bank has increased by over 250,000 since the Oslo Accords were signed in the 1990s. If elected president, how would you handle Israeli-Palestinian relations, and what would you do to help resolve this longstanding conflict? Mr. Schreiner, you have 2 minutes to respond, and your response time begins now. Wait, hold up.
This situation.
Sorry, your mic was gone, so I'm going to give you a little bit more time. So if you could please begin now.
That's probably because God didn't want me saying the first part of that. Okay, here we've done a tremendous amount of research on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And again, to go back to like I was talking about North Korea, we have to find some compromises. Number one, those settlements that are being built by Israel, those are against what's that called? The UN, what's it? Somebody else chime in and help me on this. I'm having a Joe Biden moment. Whatever. It's against international policy. And so to continue to allow these settlements to be built on occupied land, which is the part that's against the international policy, is wrong. And so we as our administration would impose sanctions on Israel until they stop doing that. We have also interviewed, this guy's wonderful. He's from Altoona, Pennsylvania, but he lives now over in Israel as Rabbis for Peace. What happens is they go into the Palestinian territories and bulldoze these homes. These rabbis from Israel go in and work side by side with the Palestinian kids and the parents in order to rebuild the homes so that the amount of hatred is quelled in tandem. We as an administration, even though you couldn't legislate that, the phraseology bully pulpit was brought up earlier. We would use the presidency as a bully pulpit to talk about these initiatives with the hopes of driving more of those kind of initiatives. We've also interviewed witnesses for peace that have gone over to Palestine and stood in front of the tanks. They stood in front of where was being shot at. Wonderful Christian organization. We need to, it's like the inner cities. At some point, some of us need to go over like these people are and stand in front of the tanks and stand in solidarity with the people that are being abused. And right now, it's my take, that's way more on the Palestinian side than it is on the Israeli side. And somebody needs to tell the truth about that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schreiner. Do we have any additional responses or rebuttals from the floor? All right, Mr. Carroll, so you do have a 1 minute response time, and your response time begins now.
In 1972, I was in Israel and I walked from Jerusalem over to Bethlehem. I walked around Jericho out to the Jordan River. And the thing that I remember most is just how small the place is. And I understand the Jewish desire to protect themselves. At one point, there's only about 25 miles between the West Bank and the sea. They could be cut apart real easily. And they are surrounded by people that have sworn to destroy them. So I understand them, and they're good, our friends, but sometimes you do have to express tough love with your friends and say, hey guys, back off.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. So with that, we will move on to our next question. This question also goes to you, Mr. Brian Carroll. So Mr. Carroll, earlier this month, the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This was our last nuclear pact with Russia. Earlier this year, the United States similarly withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action regarding Iran's nuclear program. Given this new status quo, what would your administration do to reduce tensions and nuclear proliferation? So Mr. Carroll, you have 2 minutes to respond, and your response time begins now.
Well, this may be the most difficult question that we're asking right now. Obviously, with nuclear weapons, you cannot afford to make a mistake. And I I understand that the president is concerned that both Russia and Iran were violating it. There are certain times when you have no-win situations. If the other side is violating it, you have to do something. But withdrawing from it is also got its risks. I'm not sure there is a perfect answer here. And I think we have people who've studied this much more than I have. And as president, I would lean on their expertise. I don't consider myself an expert on either Russia or Iran. And that's why we have experts.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. So, Mr. Schriner, this will be your last response for the evening, and I will. You have 1 minute, so your response time begins now.
You mean the last rebuttal, right? Or response?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah, I hate to sound like a broken record on this nuclear thing, but I think it's extremely important. With the nuclear weapons, we spend, because I've talked to a number of experts that Brian's talking about, and we spend 50 billion, that's with a B, $50 billion on nuclear weapons, and that's just to maintain our arsenal every year, not to build it up. So we have 24,000 people starving to death every day in the world, according to the UN. That's like a limited nuclear explosion going off every day in our world. So my proposal is to, again, unilaterally disarm those missiles and take the savings every year to help those people who are starving. Now, in God's world, do you think perhaps he might look at that as a much better idea? And I actually think he's a little bigger than Russia and the United States. And I hate to sound Pollyannish, but if we do the right thing, perhaps he'll protect us.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. So at this time, we've concluded our debate segment of the afternoon, and we'll be moving into our closing statements. So the closing statements will begin as follows. The first to present their closing statement will be Mr. Joshua Perkins, followed by Mr. Brian Carroll, and then subsequently concluding our afternoon will be Mr. Joe Schriner. So with that, we will move into closing statements. Mr. Perkins, you have 2 minutes to begin your closing statement, and your 2 minutes begins.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate everyone tuning in. I just want to ask you, as a final question, are you satisfied with the choices that you have when you go to the ballot box? Are you satisfied with the options you have, not just at the top of the ticket, but also for local offices and for state level offices? If you're not satisfied, if you wish we had better options, but you feel that, well, you've got to pull the lever for one person over the other because the other person is just worse, then I would encourage you to seriously consider joining the American Solidarity Party, or even joining another third party, minor party that that fits your beliefs better. But we need to have minor parties, have a political movement of minor parties, of people who are dissatisfied with the status quo, where Republicans and Democrats control the entire political discourse in this country virtually, to where we can have better options, people we can vote for and be satisfied and be glad to vote for that person. And people who will be able to enact policies that are more in line with what we believe, rather than having to just accept the general platform, even though we might disagree with much of it or even most of it. So again, I encourage you, join the American Solidarity Party, another party that you prefer, vote third party, and get active in your communities to allow third parties better access, better chance of winning elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Mr. Carroll, you now have the mic, and you may begin your 2-minute closing statement now.
Okay, I found the American Solidarity Party in August of 2016, after I had decided that there was nothing good could come from the choices we were being offered, and it was time to look ahead to 2020. I jumped in. I helped organize the Solidarity Party in California. In 2018, I ran for Congress. I could only be a part-time candidate because I was a full-time teacher. I had almost no money and almost no team, but in a field of 6, I beat the Libertarian and was fairly close to the 2 candidates just ahead of me. My previous political experience in 79, 80, I was the spokesperson for an ad hoc committee that was trying to initiate public transportation in Visalia, and we were successful. Again, in 1990, I was spokesperson for an ad hoc committee trying to prevent the opening of an abortion clinic in Visalia. And again, we were successful. 2020 is upon us. And for our party, I think the most important task of our presidential candidate will be to serve as a spokesperson for our party. And I offer myself for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. So lastly, Mr. Schriner, you now have the mic, and you may begin your 2-minute closing statement now.
Okay, here's the deal. Society is getting nuts. I mean, we know that. So what's the answer? The ASP platform points are the answer, combined with the real-life, real-time models that I've researched to bring the platform to vibrant life. And speaking of vibrant, amidst the cacophony of political and pop cultural noise, the ASP needs a vibrant, dynamic candidate to be its point person. And that person needs to not only be dynamic, but they need to have a narrative that will, in marketing terms, stick. And the party needs a person whose story will create staying power as opposed to a 15 minutes of fame phenomena, if at all. I have that narrative. A guy who has spent 30 years doing extensive cross-country research for his positions. A guy who has run in 6 election cycles. A guy who has been in 1,000 media spots. A guy who has talked at Notre Dame, Xavier, Franciscan University, to name just a few. A guy who has done so much grassroots stumping on street corners and diners at Little League ball games. It's a story ripe for hitting a tipping point. And a story that, if billed as quote unquote, the ultimate outsider, this could actually end up in the White House. I mean, and Brian was talking about this a minute ago. Look at that Jericho thing. Who would have thought on that? Actually, who would have thought on that Trump thing? So it's time for the ASP to boldly roll the dice or blow the horns and sign them for us. If you're interested in joining us, go to voteforjoe.com. Pelican power to the people. My wife told me not to do that. Okay, go ahead, Sydney.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. Thank you to all our candidates for their time and effort they spent in preparing for this debate. And this will conclude the first of our 3 planned presidential primary debates for the American Solidarity Party. Our next debate will take place on August 31st, where our candidates will take the stage together in person at the ASP Ohio's Midwestern Regional Convention in Walnut Creek, Ohio. Our final debate will take place on September 2nd, shortly before ASP members are scheduled to vote on which of these gentlemen will represent us in the 2020 United States presidential election. Thank you for joining us again this afternoon. Thank you for, to find out more information about the American Solidarity Party, please check us out online at solidarity-party.org or follow us on social media. This is Tai-Chi Kuo signing off in solidarity. All right, thanks everybody. We appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you. That was good.